We have spoken, and will continue to speak, in class about how Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany in the 1930s, and how he seized absolute control over Germany during that time. As relationships between Germany and the rest of Europe, and even the rest of the world for that matter, deteriorated throughout the 1930s, so too did living conditions deteriorate for Jews and, to a lesser degree, certain other groups within Germany. Persecution began almost immediately of the Jews, with limits placed on their occupations, with curfews placed on them so that they could only walk the streets at certain hours, with book burnings, with economic boycotts of their stores and businesses, and far more. By 1935, the Jews had been stripped of citizenship and thus of their civil rights and all voice in German affairs. Further restrictions were placed over them during the next few years, finally culminating in government-sanctioned violence on the night of Kristallnacht in November of 1938, when the government basically staged a pogrom and destroyed Jewish synagogues and businesses and homes throughout Germany. Still, the policy seemed to be focused primarily on driving Jews out of German territory, using force, using any means that worked, as well as depriving them of the use of any German resources. But at this point, it was still at the same time as the government's persecution of Jews and other groups, they also began the construction of concentration camps outside the major cities of Germany. These were camps, thousands of camps scattered throughout Germany, filled with filth, with cramped quarters for the people, disease running rampant, minimal food being given to the inmates there so that people starved to death as well as dying of disease, and so on. Brutal beatings were commonplace. People were killed for the slightest infractions or even just because somebody didn't like them. Conditions in the concentration camps were horrific beyond any normal type of description. These are the famous places like Buchenwald and Dachau and many, many others as well. One of the more unusual of the concentration camps that was created was a place called Theresienstadt, which was used as a model camp by the Nazi government for show purposes. When the Red Cross, for example, claimed that they wanted to investigate conditions in the camps because they had heard that things were so terrible there, it was Theresienstadt that they were brought to, where model storefronts were created, an orchestra was created with the Jewish inmates, and so on, to show them how wonderfully everybody was being treated. The key to survival in all of these camps was pretty consistent. It was the ability to work. Those who were able to work were given meager rations of food and allowed to continue on. Those that did not have the ability to work, they were too sick, they were too weak, they were whatever the case may be, for them life became almost impossible. They were not given food. In many cases they were shipped off to other places. And the reality is the average lifespan within the concentration camps was measured in weeks, not even in months, let alone in years. All of this changed, however, with the outbreak of war in September of 1939. With the conquest of Poland, the Germans added over 3 million Jews to their population, and all borders were closed. Expulsion ceased to be a viable option. Became the construction of ghettos within the various communities, particularly within Poland. Under the command of this man, Reinhard Heydrich, various ghetto communities were created, which were really nothing more than concentration camps in an urban environment. This way the Nazis could use existing buildings and just wall off a small section of a city, cram people in, and treat them much like they did in concentration camps. They moved the non-Jews in those areas of the city out. They gave them the homes that had been vacated by the Jews that were moved into the ghetto, or those that had been killed, as the case may be. And then they walled off entire sections of the city where the Jews were forced to live with basically no food, with no jobs, with no other resources. They were just left to mill about the streets. All of these ghettos were built near major railheads so that they could then ship in people from the surrounding countryside or from further countries and places as land was conquered during the Second World War. The largest of the ghettos was in the city of Warsaw, approaching 500,000 people in terms of the Jewish community of that particular ghetto. The second largest ghetto was in the town of Łódź, about half the size of the Warsaw community. And then there were various others in cities all over the place, like Krakow, which is the place where Oskar Schindler built his business, using Jewish slave labor to save money, and eventually saved over 1,000 lives in a remarkable transformation of character that took place during the war. Still, there appeared to be little plan for the total destruction of the Jewish community at this stage, beyond just the attrition of Jews and so on, until the summer of 1941. And in the summer of 1941, with the invasion of the Soviet Union and the addition of millions of more Jews that were in the territories conquered by the Nazis, a decision was made to adopt a new strategy. There were just too many Jews, and it was too slow to try to wall them off in ghettos and let them die there. And so the murders began. They started by using mobile killing squads known as the Einsatzgruppen. This was 4 units of military men, composed of several hundred men, under 1,000 men per unit, who traveled along right behind the German army as the front advanced into the Soviet Union, and would go into the communities, gathering up the Jews there, and basically leading them to the edge of town where they were machine gunned into ditches, ravines, or even pits that they dug themselves before they were killed. Over the next few months, it's estimated that over 1.5 million people were murdered in this way. But it was just filled with issues. There were a variety of problems. It was too slow. It made poor use of Nazi resources. It was too visible to the entire world community. And most importantly, it was just too hard on the men of the Einsatzgruppen who were expected to conduct these mass executions. And so Heydrich was charged in the summer of 1941 with finding a better and a final solution to what. That solution took shape by January of 1942, when the Nazis began the construction of 6 death camps. These were not just concentration camps. These are a little bit different. These were camps that were built and designed for the sole purpose of murdering and disposing of human beings. It was a case of applying the process of industrialization, the Industrial Revolution, if you will, to a whole new purpose and a whole new product, the destruction and disposal of human beings. The largest and most infamous of the 6 camps was Auschwitz-Birkenau. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, over 1.5 million Jews were murdered before the end of World War II. At the other 5 camps, another 2 million plus were murdered as well. The casualties are just phenomenal. The conditions were even worse than that would be found in the concentration camps that had preceded them. In addition to the murders, these were the sites of other atrocities as well. Most notable at Auschwitz-Birkenau was the work conducted by Dr. Joseph Mengele. Mengele used twins to perform medical experiments, testing to see what the limits were of human endurance and the resistance of humans to various diseases. They were placed under extreme conditions. They were injected with various chemicals and diseases and so on to see what they could withstand and what they could not. And most of them ultimately were killed. Ultimately, over 11 million people were murdered during the Nazi Holocaust, including homosexuals, gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses, handicapped, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 million Jews. Make no mistake, the world knew what was going on, even if they underestimated the dimension of what was happening. The United States, the Vatican, the British, the Soviets, all of them knew that these executions were occurring, at least to some degree or another. They knew the conditions. They knew that the Jews were being obliterated. But for a variety of reasons, next to nothing was done until in January of 1945, the Soviets entered the grounds of Auschwitz-Birkenau. What they found there staggered imagination. People dying and dead everywhere they turned. Mounds of human hair, of clothing and other belongings that had been taken from the various inmates as they arrived at Auschwitz. And so they began the process of trying to figure out what to do with this. Likewise, as spring approached, the British and American armies found somewhat similar scenes as they liberated concentration camps throughout Germany, Buchenwald and Dachau and many others. But they found the challenges still remained. It wasn't enough just to liberate the camps, to get them out from under Nazi control, because now they had to do something to help the people that were still alive to put their lives back on their feet. What they found was people who needed everything. How to eat, they needed clothing, they needed places to go. And so time was spent trying to help these people learn and cope and resume their lives. One of them said that we had learned how to die, but now we had to learn all over again how to live. Other issues had to be faced as well. How to hold people accountable for what had happened, and what to do with the Nazis that remained behind. Even more importantly, was the issue of how to prevent such things from happening again in the future. Based on our record in places like Cambodia, in places like Bosnia, and in Rwanda, it appears that we haven't been very successful. Indeed, it would seem that humankind still has some distance to go before never again becomes the true memory of